esteemed experts who have been involved with Ukraine's reforms from the inside, almost from the beginning of the war in 2014. Roman Waschuk, who was Canada's ambassador to Ukraine from 2014 to 2019, has graciously agreed to chair and moderate this discussion. He was the leader amongst ambassadors in Kyiv during his tenure and was able to fully develop the Canadian presence in Ukraine. Roman conducted Canadian diplomacy with integrity, openness, sincerity, accessibility, and optimism. The Ukrainian Canadian Congress was pleased to recently honor Roman and his spouse Oksana Makarova at a tribute gala in February for their service to Canada and their tireless efforts in building and strengthening the Canada-Ukraine relationship. We're very much looking forward to hearing from our discussants, who will be now introduced by Roman Waschuk. Romane, будь ласка.
Thank you very much, Lesa. And indeed, we have people with us who each bring their own expertise and perspective to the year that was, and maybe some inklings of what might be to come. So we have with us Jill Sinclair, who is the senior official in charge of preparing the Ukraine Reform Conference, and that means both contents and logistics. And sometimes logistics can be scarier even than contents, but she masterfully took care of both, and drawing in part on a very long-standing public service career, now culminating in being the Canadian member of the Defense Reform Advisory Board for Ukraine. I think she's the longest serving member of that board, and looking at the intricacies of making Ukraine a more effectively safe place. Then also Oksana Makarova. She was both a part of the team that made Ukrainian finance sector reform happen from 2014 to 2020, and then leading it from 2018 as Minister of Finance. She no doubt will tell you it was one of the more relaxing periods of her life, and a real expert also in Ukraine dealing with international financial institutions, both the IMF and the World Bank and many of the other European institutions, as well as then dealing with Ukrainian interest groups, which is a huge challenge in and of itself. We also have Taras Shevchenko of the Reanimation Package for Reforms. He is just as committed to a more just society as his namesake, and he steered the consultations and adoption of civil society Toronto principles. They were consulted across Ukraine, and will be telling us how that process looks from the perspective of a year out. We also have with us Matt Simpson, CEO of a long-running Canadian investment story, Black Iron. The company got a shout out from President Zelensky at the Ukraine Reform Conference last year, and we're checking in to see what's been happening since then. CIC in Saskatchewan was used the word great in relation to what I'd be doing here in this panel, so I'm going to take it literally and figuratively. So greatness in moderation, both in terms of trying to be a great moderator, but also in terms of being moderate in how much I say. So I'll take only a few minutes to reflect on the year that was. I was, with Jill, part of the organizing team from the Kyiv end. It ended up being a huge political as well as logistical challenge, given the timing. In between presidential elections and pre-term parliamentary elections, outgoing cabinet, incoming president, it was all moving all the time. I've also, since 2016, been to all the Ukraine reform conferences, and this was the biggest and best of them all. They were designed from the start to be the public face of Western support, and also then a form of encouragement for Ukraine to keep going on issues and do better. And I'd like here to maybe give a break to George Soros and to his minions in Ukraine, the so-called Sorosiata, much evoked now by certain pro-oligarch and pro-Russian interest groups in Ukraine, who would like to blame reforms and policies on Mr. Soros and minions. I'd like to take some of the blame, or I'd prefer to see it as credit, for Canada. If the URC was the public face of support, Mr. Honcharuk rather, was at the Reform Conference as President Zelensky's economic policy deputy in the presidential office, and was already at that time getting a Canadian finance team to put together a reform program that ultimately became the program of the government, which unfortunately was short-lived, but did manage to achieve a number of things in its 6 months of existence. So if you think that the conference was only a public show, no, there was always lots going on in the background. I think we'll be hearing from panelists about that. Then in February, March, the wheels came off that particular government project. Finance Minister Makarova departed, and we've seen a seeming impatience on the part of the president with the idea of systemic change. Where are the quick wins? Who will fix the squeaky wheel? Who's got the grease? And for the grease, you've got quick fixes from old style faces brought out of obscurity, mixed in with some continuing change in some areas. So I guess the question we've got is, what's the mood music? Is it, as some have written in the past few days in Kyiv, a requiem for reform? Is it the Kvartal 95 theme music? Is it the national anthem? Is it an intermezzo between one kind of music and or some other kind of music? These are the questions we and you, our audience, will be thinking about while taking in the presentations to come. After the presentations, we'll start with a couple of video questions and go to your questions on chat Q&A. So I'd like to first invite Jill Sinclair to lead off.
Thanks, Roman. Thanks for that great introduction. And let me thank UCC, Ottawa, CIC Saskatchewan, and you, my friend, Roman, terrific colleague for many years. And thanks to everyone for bringing us all back together again. It's hard to believe that it's almost a year since Toronto. As Roman said, those were very, very different times. We had a Toronto conference where we brought about 800 participants, 37 countries, civil society, international organizations, members of the Hromadkas. We had the Canadian and global Ukrainian diaspora community with us for 3 days. It was, you're right, Roman, the biggest and best, of course, but we're going to say that. In your musical kind of description of what we're doing, I guess I'm the overture, because I'm kind of the lead up to everything, and we'll be reflecting back a little bit. But Toronto was always as much about looking backwards as looking forward. So, you know, Toronto was a joint effort, Canada and Ukraine. And I have to say that's shorthand for a lot of resolute teamwork that went on. As you said, Roman, it was just the tip of the iceberg that people saw in Toronto. But your team in Kyiv, the extraordinary team at Cabinet of Ministers that we worked with in Ukraine, all of our international partners, this was a team effort. But most of all, it was about Ukrainian ownership and leadership, because of course, reform is all about Ukraine's future, and that requires their leadership. And that was part of our approach from the outset. Toronto was interesting because as a meeting, I think we saw Toronto as just an inflection point. An international meeting is not an outcome, at least not in my view. It's a means to a much larger purpose and objective. So Toronto, the actual meeting in July, was important to get right, logistics and substance, not least of all because former Foreign Minister Chrystia Freeland expected us to get it right. But Toronto, the process was much more important. For that reason, we decided early on to have a path, a road to Toronto and a road beyond Toronto. And it was based on a few key operating principles. The first one was open and inclusive partnership. This meant not just the usual foreign ministers and governments and international organizations, the folks that always trot out for these international meetings, but we wanted to have the private sector, we wanted to have civil society, we wanted DRAB members and Canadian parliamentarians and the diaspora community with us from the beginning and throughout and part of Toronto, because we wanted to make this an inclusive approach. And not just inclusive for the people who were in Toronto, but for those who could be involved in the process along the way. And that's why, as you've just mentioned, Roman, the extraordinary effort that RPR with Taras and all of his colleagues to develop the Toronto principles that went across Ukraine to make sure that we got a lot of the not usual suspects and to make sure that we heard a lot of different voices. This was extremely important to us as we conceived Toronto. We wanted to have an interactive meeting, a forum for really honest discussion and debate. We wanted it to look more like, say, Power and Politics or the BBC's Hard Talk than a traditional series of prepared speeches. Indeed, we actually tried to do away with prepared speeches, which I'd be happy to talk about. We were not successful. But we did have real dialogue, and we did have roundtables, and we did have panel discussions. And we wanted to showcase the new Ukraine. We worked with Ukraine Invest, and we brought to Toronto Ukraine House, something they'd created for Davos. But in Toronto, unlike the exclusive setting of Davos, everyone was invited. And Ukraine was a place, Ukraine House rather, was a place that we showed off the innovation and creativity of Ukraine and Ukrainians, to show the other side of Ukraine that people don't often see, because they have some sort of opinions formed about Ukraine. Some of them are formed by Russian kind of misinformation, and others just by their relentlessness of the news about Ukraine, which is usually not good. We wanted to show the vibrancy of Ukraine and its role as an innovation generator in the heart of Europe. And we wanted to have the diaspora with us as partners from the outset. And here I have to say such a big thank you to Eeyore and his team in Ottawa, to everyone. The UCC was an extraordinary partner from the very beginning of the preparations. Thanks to their efforts, we were able to include Ukrainian Canadian communities across the country, knowing that each is different and distinct, and that together they constitute a very dynamic part of Canada and our history. And a special point here was thanks to the work of the UCC that we were able to have the Holodomor mobile classroom in Toronto, so that URC participants and anyone interested was able to be reminded again to never forget. And of course, this was a diplomatic initiative, so there were some international partners that we had to deal with too. And I say that flippantly, but honestly, we had extraordinary international support, beginning with the UK and Denmark, who were the previous hosts of the earlier URC conferences. We wanted to build on their success. We wanted to make sure that we developed momentum. And we worked with Ukraine's closest friends and supporters. We were very lucky that Roman was chairing a great group of G7 ambassadors at the time in Kyiv, so we had all of that to feed into our preparations. But I also developed a small group of the closest friends. We wanted to make sure that we had continuity in our effort, that it wasn't just about Toronto, and we wanted to find a next host, and we did, when Lithuania stepped forward to say that they would host in 2020. Obviously, that meeting's not happening because of COVID, but it's scheduled for next year, next summer. And we already have the next host after that in Switzerland. So there is momentum behind this effort. And we took a very deliberate approach to the substance and outcome of Toronto. Taras will speak about the Toronto principles. But we knew, and we still know, that comprehensive reform, as you've just described, Roman, is extremely complex. It's very long-term. It can be very unpopular, and is extremely vulnerable to the vagaries of politics. Our agenda was focused on key issues like inclusive democracy and prosperity, the rule of law. It was designed to highlight the foundations of Ukraine's democratic future, and to get people, to the extent we could in Toronto, on the record committing to that. We knew that in Toronto, it would be important to underscore reform achievements to date, but not so much to celebrate success, I have to say, more to protect and reinforce those foundational reforms, to draw a line under them, to make sure that there couldn't be any or not too much backsliding. Things like independent anti-corruption institutions, independent national bank, decentralization, reform of the judiciary, security and defense, of great interest to me. We knew that some reforms could or would be vulnerable under any government. We knew that there were always going to be powerful vested interests who would continue to try to point things in a direction that benefited them, not broader society. And that's why we knew that this effort in Toronto, going into Toronto and beyond, needed much more than governments around the table. It needed civil society, and it needed communities of committed Ukrainians, private sector, reform-minded RADA members to make sure that they were a driving force going forward. And this was especially true in Ukraine, where we know that civil society is so important, such a force for change and accountability, and is never shy about making its views known. So to conclude, the Toronto URC was not about 3 days in Toronto in July, as marvelous as they were. It was actually about using the forcing function of a major international meeting to galvanize attention on Ukraine, reinforce voices of reform and accountability, build resilience for the long haul, to put in place the elements of an agenda to go forward, and to build a community of interest and support to work together before, during, and well after Toronto to ensure that Ukrainians got the chance to have the future that they fought for in the Revolution of Dignity and Maidan and over so many decades. And it was also about sending clear political messages. First, to Ukraine and to Ukrainians, that the world still cared. The world supported Ukraine's aspirations. Second, to Russia, that their aggression and disinformation, daily hybrid and kinetic war, were not going to confuse or deter Ukraine's friends, nor change Ukraine's determination to seek its own sovereign path forward. And Toronto finally was a unique platform to send a message to Ukrainian political leaders, actual or aspiring, and RADA members, that progress to date had been hard work, and that Ukrainians with the support of the global community would be vigilant and watching to make sure that the foundational principles of accountable democracy, transparency, anti-corruption, the rule of law, and the fundamental dignity of all people remain strong. That was the message of Toronto. It probably still resonates today, but I'll let Roman take that idea forward as he moves on to our other panelists. Dakuyu.
It would work better if I were unmuted. Indeed. So freedom to speak. And I'll use that freedom to invite Oksana Makarova to continue. She, I think, faced some of those challenges and potential for rollback that Jill outlined, managed to lay the groundwork for Ukraine's new IMF program in the interim, but now looks at it from a place outside government. So I think that would make us particularly interested in your perspective, Oksana.
Thank you very much, Roman. And I would like to start by thanking Canada in general. I mean, thanking Jill, thanking UCC, thanking you, Roman, personally, not only for the Reform Conference, but for supporting Ukraine with reform infrastructure during this past 5 years. And it has been instrumental for several governments to get what we wanted to get faster when we had all the advice and advisory and support structures from, in general, G7 and our partners, but Canada in particular. So that has been a big part of Ukraine's success. And it laid the foundation. We'll talk about what music is playing now, but it laid a very solid foundation for Ukraine to succeed, which I'm sure. When we started the conference in Canada a year ago, there were 4 basic aims in general for us that we wanted to achieve. First, of course, is to evaluate the past year of the reforms and evaluate whether we are on track, are we moving in the right direction. Second is for Ukraine to show the world where we are, what are we doing, and to hear from the world also the response, whether Ukraine, whatever we think should be the priorities, our partners in general, especially international business, is viewing it the same. Third, which is also very important, is to generate the support for Ukraine. As Jill rightfully said, the war didn't go anywhere, and Ukraine needed support last year, needs support now more than ever. And also get the investors and business together to firmly put Ukraine on the map. Now, when we were discussing it last June, the main theme was how on the backdrop of economic stability, macroeconomic stability, which we have achieved during the previous couple of years, how to accelerate growth, how to outperform our neighbors and how to close the gap between Ukraine and, say, Poland or others. And the agenda last year, I think, was probably the most ambitious out of all reform conferences, because there was a big window of opportunity, and everyone saw that big window of opportunity in Ukraine, but also outside of Ukraine. I also wanted to say that all the reforms that we have discussed, and some of them were in the principles, and some were discussed in the main panels, and some on the side meetings, but decentralization, monetary banking system reform, public finance reform, healthcare reform, which started already last year, generated very good results at the first level, first pillar of the health reform. Education reform was the new Ukrainian school. I mean, there were so many achievements already during the last year, which generated a lot. And there was a big reform agenda that was set during the Toronto conference. And right after that, rightfully said, at the end of summer, we had the new government. It was a mixture of new people and some people with the experience from the previous governments. And we have entered the turbo regime, which was widely praised by the international experts, widely praised by the civil society. And I have to say that during this first 3 months, we managed to adopt together with the parliament pretty much everything that we discussed during the past 3 years, and there were difficulties with some of the laws. So turbo regime really worked. What turbo regime didn't generate, it didn't generate turbo results. And it couldn't generate turbo results, unfortunately. But you're absolutely right that this impatience, and it has been in Ukraine for the past 27 years, we always, as Ukrainians, I would say, we not, or as business, are overly expecting the very quick results when, in fact, some of the reforms take years or even, dozens of years to fully generate the results. And the reforms that we were able to do in Ukraine, like, for example, public finance reform, it took Poland 10 years to do the fiscal decentralization and public finance reform. It took France almost 10 years to go through the treasury and public finance reform. We managed to do some of them really quick. So now with the replacement of the government and then COVID, and more than COVID, not only Ukrainian but international also measures to prevent the spread, the COVID completely changed the landscape. So even during the Davos in January, the situation was still, start looking from now, I would say, rosy. We borrowed we went with our Eurobond placement at the market, and it was the cheapest placement of the Eurobonds in euro ever Ukraine had. There was a big rally. The attention to Ukraine was huge. We were still debating whether the growth will be 3.5% GDP or more. And now the situation is totally different, with even those sectors of the industry, which still in January and February, everyone predicted to grow, like transport, services, construction. Now everything is in decline, and now it's just a competition of who will be more conservative. Is it going to be -5% or is it going to be -10% of GDP? Now, I should say that there are two proofs that the reforms of the past 5 years actually generated very solid results. Because if you look how Ukraine moved not only through politically turbulent 2020, the year of 2 elections, the year when the majority of politicians changed in Ukraine, we managed to finance the budget, we managed to keep the deficit below 2%, the hryvnia has been stable and even appreciating in 2019. So Ukraine has finally institutionalized changes in a lot of areas, including the independent NBU, which, regardless of the political developments, regardless of the political changes, and Ukraine is a democracy, so we expect and there will be political changes. It's a nature of democracy, but the government works. Now, the reforms were not completed everywhere, and we see some backrolling on the reforms. The second pillar of the health reform did not start on April 1st as it was planned. We see some discussions on the education, which are worrisome, and we are yet to have the education minister. the midterm budgeting, my favorite reform, something with what I came to the government, and we managed to get, it's a very difficult reform to turn from 1 year budgeting to 3 year budgeting, but it's very necessary reform for business to provide for certainty in the future. It was also due to COVID, as explained by the government, postponed to 1 year. So there are a lot of reasons for business or for civil society or for people now to be, or for active civil society now to asking questions. Are the reforms slowing down? Are the reforms, have reforms stopped in some areas? Now, Ukraine has always been, coming back at the end to the musical terminology, Ukraine has always been a potpourri. It has always been a lot of different musics, sometimes at the same times. And it was never a period in Ukrainian history when we all did what we should have been doing at the same pace and at the same direction. So, and again, I think looking at different countries, for democracy, it's more a rule rather than exceptions. I mean, we all wanted, of course, to do all the reforms in the turbo regime because we knew that Ukraine could look much different and that business could thrive and Ukraine could be one of the last fastest growing markets in Europe. And that would attract a lot of investments, which we need. So now I think the approach is should be a little bit different, but crisis does not mean we have to stop the reforms. Crisis means we have to focus on the reforms, but maybe focus on a few reforms rather than spread the resources. Because again, as political experts say, it's in every country, it's the active minority who sets the direction, it's the majority who sets the pace. So I think on the basis of a lot of good laws adopted during the turbo regime, we should focus on 3 main areas right now. And when I say we, I mean Ukrainian business, Ukrainian civil society, Ukrainian government, and we have to also from the business push the government in these reforms. First is rule of law. I think it's becoming more and more clear that if we want investments in Ukraine, and we do want investments because I believe that the only return to the economic growth, which is the issue now, we are not talking how to accelerate, we are talking now in Ukraine how to return to economic growth. We can only quickly return to economic growth, not through fiscal stimulus, not through monetary stimulus, which some people are discussing right now, that can be in addition to, but only through influx of the foreign direct investments. In order to have 10 billion plus a year investments, and that should be a target, we should fix the rule of law. We should create the rule of law, and it means the judiciary, and it means on the basis of the Supreme Court start. This is something that I think Ukrainian business and civil society should focus more. The second part is, together with the rule of law reform, to preserve the macroeconomic stability, hence the healthy public finances. And I think the task for Ukrainian government should be to return to below 3% budget deficit as soon as possible, almost 8% budget, which the RADA recently voted the changes to the budget. It could be as a quick response to COVID, but it should be temporary, and we should, as soon as possible, to go back to the normal and healthy levels of the deficit. And third is the human capital reform. And therefore, I think the focus right now of everyone should be on healthcare reform and on educational reform, because this is and the labor code. That together will allow us to create the markets, normal market for land, and hopefully the law will be supplemented and it will be more liberal and more open, and the capital market which would allow more wide participation of business, more wide participation of individuals in the economic growth. So again, I cannot say that I'm totally happy returning now to business, and there are still huge opportunities in business and huge opportunities for investments in Ukraine. But I think business and civil society, this is times when we all should be more active, more vocal, and push for this right reforms in rule of law and human capital development, and Ukraine's potential can still be achieved and fully realized.
Thank you very much, Oksana. I'd like to welcome the fact that there are nearly 100 of us here on the Zoom platform listening in, including many people from Canadian civil society who are interested in Ukraine, both from the UCC and Canadian International Council group of interested and active citizens. So therefore, and I know there are also people watching on Facebook, so a welcome to you too. I think all of us will then be particularly interested in what Ukrainian civil society has to say, and so I would like to invite Taras Shevchenko to share some of his thoughts with us right now.
Thank you, Roman. Hi, everyone. As Roman mentioned at the beginning that he was part of every previous Ukraine Reform Conference, I had similar pleasure to participate both in London, then in Copenhagen, and then in Toronto. And I can also agree that Toronto conference was the one with the biggest scale, and preparation by civil society of Toronto Principle as a document about reform process in Ukraine was also something unique that happened last year, 1 year ago, but actually was happened during some period of time because that was the long process of preparation. And it's interesting to see right now, 1 year after the conference, where we are standing. So just to remind that Toronto Principle as a document was prepared by civil society, a short 3-4 pager about most of the reforms, where we are standing, and what civil society is expecting from the future. And while at the beginning where we were thinking about future developments of the reform, at the moment of finalizing text, after working groups, civil society organizations, peer reviews, and also discussion in regions, we had election in place, and Mr. Volodymyr Zelensky became a president of Ukraine. And there was really very big uncertainty. No one could say and predict what kind of Ukraine we will have, what kind of governments of Ukraine we would have. And in terms of the document as Toronto Principle, we a little bit refocused on that to also see Toronto Principle document as a position where we stay already, where reforms had progress, and as kind of red lines where we cannot go back on any backwards from those positions that were received. And reviewing from time to time and reviewing the documents now before this conference, I can say that in most cases, as if we speak without rather emotions or personal likes or dislikes, we are mostly staying on those positions that were referred in the documents. And I would like to highlight several of more positive cases and more positive reform areas, and several less successful and maybe troubling reform areas. And within positive, I want to mention election legislation. And while we were 1 year ago thinking about final introduction of the new system of proportional voting, and the law was primarily voted by previous parliaments, but right now we are in a final position that we do have new election code, and most of positions that were provided in Toronto Principles, they are already in place in the legislation. Of course, we are looking forward not just to have legislation, but also fair and democratic elections in place. And local elections for October is a challenge, both from organizational point of view, but also from health and COVID situation, how it's going to happen. On the side of election, I'm pretty happy with the development of electoral reform. Second positive reform that I was really happy that it's happening during previous president and continuing is decentralization. The decentralization is really important reform for Ukraine, and that's the area where also Canada is helping. And the steps forward with that reform and finalizing the administrative territorial status of Ukrainian territories. It's also is mostly done in line as a continuation of previous reform that was happening, and most experts on civil society side, they are included in this process of working on this reform. Media reform is the third one that I'd like to mention as positive, and organization where I'm working as a director, Center for Democracy and Rule of Law, is pretty involved into media reform, and funding for public service broadcasting was slightly increased for this year, even though they had some problems with paying fines under the previous court decisions from the state broadcaster. We just had ratification, and it was successful advocacy campaign of our NGO as well, ratification of European Convention on Access to Official Documents. And Ukraine will launch this convention not only for Ukraine, but for previous 9 countries, because we are country number 10 who ratified the convention, and now it will be in place. And we also work on the media law, and my colleagues are part of the working group to work on the new media law, while conversation about dangerous law on propaganda with previous minister, that it's ended with nothing, and actually with the end of the minister. Somewhere in the middle, I would mention, in the middle as positive, negative, I would mention anti-corruption and judiciary reform. That's the area we would like to expect much more. And with anti-corruption, for example, we had the launch of anti-corruption agency, which is slightly positive for the agency. We still have fight again, or as our perception that there is some fight against quite independent anti-corruption bureau, with anti-corruption bureau still standing in a position, and anti-corruption court launched its work, but definitely that's area where much more should be done. And the same with judiciary. There were some developments in this area. I will not go into detail, but definitely that's the area that the much bigger progress we would like to see. With the minuses, I would like to mention health reform, and Oksana Makarova already mentioned that. We see this, that the previous team actually resigned from their position, including some middle personnel, and that there is no continuity in the reform for the secondary health system. Also, I would say that rather minus is public administration, and I wasn't happy that how much was done during the previous president, and now we rather see that instead of competitions that we put in the Toronto principles, we see withdrawal from that principle and getting rid of some of the pro-reformer people in the government actually against this reform. The third minus area I would mention defense, and we also do not really see the strengthening of the defense system, and that's why I would rather see that as a minus. Going to some conclusions, I would like to say that civil society is still a very strong player in the reform process, and it's really important that civil society should be protected, defended, and that activity of civil society would be both supported by international community, but also protected by Ukrainian legislation. The day after tomorrow, we as part of civil society will be presenting the detailed roadmap of the legal provisions for the civil society that we were working out with many other organizations. It will be draft document, the finalized until September. And again, we both see some positive steps that generally civil society is protected, but still some negative legislation, again suggesting to have some foreign funding rules that would be very damaging for civil society. Or we observe Sternenko case where we see some selective justice, and that Mr. Sternenko, an activist, was not, his right to health was not, and life was not protected. I'd like to thank Canada and and you personally for support of Ukraine, and we'll be happy to see some questions and to answer to them. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Taras. I've been looking at the attendee list, hoping to find Mr. Ivan Franco of Toronto to be able to get him to ask a question, but he's not logged on. But I would ask, maybe now would be the moment, just before we go to Matt, to ask our technical hosts to put up the poll on where you're plugging in from, so we can have a quick overview of whether we are indeed reaching from coast to coast to coast and internationally. So if you wouldn't mind clicking in from where you are watching, that will help us know what our reach is today. In addition to that, we've talked about the reform framework. The reform framework is supposed to create sufficient preconditions for individual citizens, but also private sector actors from within Ukraine and outside Ukraine to be able to do business. During his speech to the Economic Club of Toronto as part of the Ukraine Reform Conference, President Zelensky offered a few shout outs to Canadian investment projects. One of the key ones there was to Black Iron, and Black Iron CEO Matt Simpson is with us. You've been trying to get an iron ore project in Kryvyi Rih, which happens to be President Zelensky's hometown, going for 8.5, 9 years. I mean, maybe I've lost count by now. Have you found some of the traction you were looking for? Because a bit like the president, you were impatient last year. And how's it going so far? Give us an update, please, Matt.
Thank you, Roman, and good afternoon or good evening, depending on where people are located on this call. It's actually been 10 years, which is quite shocking on how fast time flies. And to put it in perspective, within the first 3 years of Black Iron being listed on the Toronto Stock Exchange, we did actually bring the project to a near construction-ready state. And then unfortunately, when the war broke out in the eastern part of the country, that did cause some of our larger investors to pull out and force us to put the project on care and maintenance up until about 2 years ago. And we resurrected the project then for several reasons, most importantly of which seeing quite a bit more stability in the eastern part of the country, coupled with iron ore prices, which have just been on an absolute tear, breaking through $100 a ton through most of this year. So I think to come back to President Zelensky, I would say that since making those statements of support, as you mentioned, he has really followed through on his word, but action taken by members of Parliament on items that are essential for our project's development has been slow in coming. I did, subsequent to meeting President Zelensky here in Toronto, meet directly with Prime Minister Waschuk and also with the then Minister of Economy, who both stated their strong support for our project and stated how important it was to have concrete examples of foreign direct investment so they can help attract other investments to Ukraine with the ultimate goal of improving living standards. This resulted in what may have been the first investment nanny ever being appointed. So we did actually have someone that was very close to the Prime Minister, accountable for all the different items of government support that we needed on our project. We created a roadmap jointly with this investment nanny that laid out each of those items, the most important of which is actually some land that's currently owned by the state government being used by the Ministry of Defense for training, of which we need a small portion to be able to construct our mine. And we met with the Minister of Defense along with support from Canada's MC, which was hugely appreciated. And that resulted in November of 2019 having a memorandum of understanding signed jointly by Black Iron and the then Minister of Defense, whereby there is an agreement for the land required to be transferred to Black Iron in exchange for us providing funding that would be used largely to create new barracks, which were direly needed, but also to build a new ammunition storage depot. And people may recall in September of last year, there was actually a fire at a Ukrainian ammunition depot that set off several ordnance. So it was very, very topical at this time for a Canadian company to be offering to build a new ammunition storage depot to NATO standards, which helped bring focus to our project. Somewhat frustratingly, though, since signing that memorandum of understanding, we had quite a bit of trouble getting the Minister of Defense to focus on progressing those discussions to ultimately lead to the land transfer. And then, as I'm sure everyone knows, in March, ultimately the Minister of Defense, Prime Minister, and several other ministers were all let go. This resulted in further time being lost since the new Minister of Defense had to come up to speed on Blackiron's project, and it also required a new investment nanny to be appointed. So I think one of the lessons, at least in our case, is that we lobbied quite hard for the new investment nanny to be part of the President's administration, because we wanted to have greater stability and influence over the Ministry of Defense on trying to get this deal done. And in fairness to President Zelensky, once he did find out that Blackiron's land transfer file had slowed, he actually met with the new Minister of Defense and explained the importance of this project to Ukraine and made it a very high priority. And the new Minister of Defense has really taken that to heart. He actually came to Kryvyi, where our project is located, to personally conduct a tour, meet with the local commanders of that base and understand what this land transfer entails. He also met with local stakeholders, local members of government, who all expressed their strong support for the project to occur. So we're getting now very good traction with the new Ministry of Defense. We're having regular meetings on this land transfer and actually even put together a detailed schedule of all the different actions that need to occur, which is being agreed on. And we're also getting strong support from other agencies such as GNADRA to renew our permits, which is also quite key. And kind of topically, just this past weekend, President Zelensky was interviewed by the Globe and Mail, which is a big newspaper here in Canada. And he issued a statement on his official website, again reinforcing the importance of Ukraine's relationship with Canada, and specifically his support for Blackiron's project, which is great to hear. So I'd say some of the key takeaways from my side are that President Zelensky definitely is following through on his word, which is hugely appreciated and critical for our project success. I would say that our progress to date seems to be driven more by individuals pushing agenda items to get things done, as opposed to an aligned focus between various government agencies on items of priority. And that it's really critical now that we do have stability, especially at the MP level, to make sure that we can see through all the different initiatives that are required to get this project constructed with strong focus.
Thank you, Matt. And I think this one particular case illustrates some of the broader trends that previous panelists were talking about. Personal intervention as opposed to institutionalization, the travails that occur when governments change rapidly, but a determination by everyone concerned to keep pushing on. So I think that's important to pick up as well. We have, I think, an initial question coming in on video from our partners at CIC South Saskatchewan. So I'd like to see them brought up here on screen and launch the question, and then we'll see who we direct it to from the panelists, or some, or maybe all.
Thank you very much. My name is Alexander Shaloshny. I'm with the Canadian International Council South Saskatchewan branch. The CIC is a nonpartisan foreign policy think tank with branches throughout the country. We've been focusing a lot on engaging with Canadians on foreign policy issues of late. So I would encourage folks in Canada to check out their local branch to get involved and to buy membership. So our question, with the Toronto conference, there's a big focus on national to national government approach, reading the statement and things like that. What role is there for Canada's subnational governments to engage with Ukraine? And this may be even a question for a moderator who has experience with all sorts of engagement. So I'll just throw it open to everyone.
Okay. Now, if I am still unmuted, which I hope I am, I will first throw the question over to Jill, who's also an expert in Canadian governance, and then maybe add a few words after she takes a crack at it.
Thanks, Roman. Thanks, Alexander, for the question. So subnational levels of government, it's an interesting question, because if I think a little bit about how we approached the Toronto meeting, because of decentralization, which Taras and Oksana and others have spoken about, we were very, very focused on getting below the federal level, below the national level, because we knew it was so important to see how reform was being developed, what the issues were at the local level. So I think that there's an awful lot of potential here to, particularly in dealing with Ukrainian reform, to deal at the subnational levels of government. There's massive space here for capacity building. There's massive space here for education and training. Indeed, in Toronto, we brought many members of the amalgamated communities to Canada specifically on a study tour to do that. So I think that reform has to have national direction, but it's implemented at the local level. So we have to connect those two. Over to you, Roman.
Thank you, Jill. I think there has been considerable provincial interest also in working with Ukraine, but it comes and goes and is subject to the vagaries of Canadian politics as well. Sometimes electoral politics or decisions by ministers. For example, we had a delightful visit by an Ontario health minister, where we then toured around a number of facilities, and I was making great plans, and then that person resigned a week later in Toronto, which did not do a whole lot for continuity on the Canadian end. We, I think, also sometimes have to deal with the fact that there are pressures on subnational governments in both provincial and municipal in Canada to mind their knitting. And that while on the one hand, politicians may like to say, oh, here's something we've done with a country that is important to a whole bunch of our voters, they also have to contend with all the voters saying, how about the pothole on my street? Why are you possibly involved with some country the other side of the world? One of the ways we've reconciled that, and I think we'll have a Q&A chat question on this from someone from FCM, is through the Federation of Canadian Municipalities, which has done a lot of the work with Ukraine's regions and with key cities in 4 regions across the country in bringing the sort of citizen-friendly, subnational modes of Canadian consultation, Canadian governance, open municipal government, etc., open budgeting to the regional and municipal level. So, in terms of Alex's question, I think there's a lot there, and some provinces actually have advisory councils on relations, and I think Saskatchewan does, and Manitoba has a minister who's a focal point, so does Alberta. The question is, how do you leverage that in a situation where resources are limited and where there are differing expectations, stakeholder expectations on the Canadian provincial side as to just how much should be done and who should be paying for it. Thank you for that one. And now for our next question, we go to...
If I
sure.
may jump and expand
Absolutely.
a little bit on what Jill said on that issue. Again, the decentralization, big part of which was fiscal decentralization. So all the local taxes in Ukraine stay now in local communities, and big portion of the corporate profit tax and the personal income tax also stays there. So the 4 years of decentralization already created some very capable local governments in Ukraine, which are actually in some areas could be even more capable in attracting foreign direct investments or helping Ukrainian businesses to export. And I think that creates a very solid basis for municipal to municipal cooperation, for I think where Canadian local government representatives, together with business associations, together with Ukrainian West, can be really successful is getting in contact directly with the local governments in Ukraine and being this forum and this links that will help to Canadian businesses, but also to Ukrainian businesses to cooperate. And that would be a win-win situation, not like taken from Canada to Ukraine or taken from Ukraine to Canada. That would expand the trade and that would expand the investment opportunities for both.
Right. Thank you, Oksana. And I'd recall in relation to that, the situation with Kolomea in Ivano-Frankivsk region, which was one of our partner cities for the Pledge project. When I met with the mayor there, and this concerned a German investment, not a Canadian one, I met with a German investor, and they said that when they built their first factory in Ukraine, they had to take a trip to Kyiv every week to borrow, beg, or steal permissions of various sorts. But in building their second factory, which was in Kolomea as opposed to the previous one, they had been able to resolve almost all of their permitting issues at city or regional level. So I think that's a very practical example of what Oksana's been talking about. Any other reactions on the local subnational level question? Nope. Then let's go on to Maria Kuprianova from Ukrainian World Congress, because we also have a bit of a global audience, as our poll showed us, with a question.
Hello, thank you, Ambassador. Thank you to the event organizers and panelists for this insightful and in-depth discussion today. I am the Executive Director of the Ukrainian World Congress, and UWC, the Ukrainian World Congress, is the international coordinating body for Ukrainian communities in the diaspora. So in all of the comments today, I believe we've heard a common thread, the need to maintain reform momentum or tempo, if we are speaking in musical terms, to implement the ambitious vision for a European, Euro-Atlantic future of Ukraine. And the Ukrainian World Congress shares the universal commitment to Ukraine as a sovereign, independent state with strong democratic institutions, prosperous market economy. And GWC has been a proud partner of the Ukraine House Toronto, as well as Ukraine House Davos for a number of years in a row. These are the vital initiatives in promoting Ukraine, its economic investment, cultural potential to the international community. We are, of course, grateful for Canada's leadership in supporting Ukraine and standing firmly in defense of its territorial integrity against Russian aggression and standing firmly in support of reforms in Ukraine. And today we had a chance to discuss progress in a number of key areas of reform, land reform, banking legislation. Of course, we live in a very different world now compared to the previous year. So with that in mind, we do share the concern of the international community and the civil society that some of the key reform areas outlined in Toronto principles could be vulnerable. There is a risk of backsliding. We share the concern of the international community and the civil society about some of the alarming signs of political retribution, selective justice, and of course, embedding the rule of law across the entire justice system is a vital enabler for economic growth. We have met Simpson, Representable of foreign investors, here with us today. So of course, political vendetta, selective justice would undermine Ukraine's credibility with international partners and most importantly, foreign investors. But with all these in mind, the complex situation, I'd be really interested to hear the views from the panelists today. So in your view, how can the Ukrainian World Congress and global Ukrainian community best contribute to maintaining and strengthening the international coalition of support to reforms in Ukraine?
Okay, thank you. I will direct that question first to Ukrainian civil society, to Taras Shevchenko.
That was a little bit unexpected to me. Can you please or give floor to someone else or repeat the last sentence?
Okay, if I can maybe recap, given trends in Ukraine right now, how much can the global Ukrainian community, what can it do to help hold the line where there might be regression and keep pushing for positive change? How can they work with your organizations or work with government to help achieve those goals?
Okay, I believe that the world Ukraine community is already doing a very good job and knows much better than me all the possible ways how to both influence Ukrainian government and help Ukrainian civil society. And there are two general ways for global Ukrainians. First is to work directly. Second, to work through foreign governments, for Ukraine, but probably home governments for yourself, and making sure that Canadian government is good friend, is good job supporting Ukraine, or other countries are supporting Ukraine. I don't have any specific, and actually I'm less well known with these activities of Canadian community, and I really think that you know much better than me.
Okay, I see Jill smiling there, but she's been, well, always dangerous. She's been observing the interactions, so maybe there's a view you could share on how stakeholders can operate within the current situation. As soon as she's unmuted.
Lovely to see you, Maria. Look, just a quick thought on this. I think that there's always this massive potential that governments, even though those that are clearly very supportive of Ukraine, get kind of tired. They get distracted. Sometimes we hear people talking about Ukraine fatigue. Oh my goodness, all we hear about are problems. There's of course massive disinformation out there from Russia. That Ukraine is only conflict, it's only corruption, it's only division. We know there are issues, but we also know there's another narrative and story. I think that the world Ukrainian community can help by just keeping heads clear about really what the challenges are, where the interventions need to be made, and also to make sure that people just don't get tired, because frankly, Ukrainians don't have the luxury of getting tired. And those that really care about a future of Ukraine in a Euro-Atlantic setting have to stay with them throughout this. Thanks.
Okay, now we go to the, thank you, Maria. Now we go to the chat Q&A questions submitted. One from a participant in last year's event, a certain Andriy Shevchenko, who is actively listening in. But before I go to his question, I will give an advance notice question for Jill, which comes from Andrew Rasulis, someone who also has a bit of a defense background, saying, Taras mentioned his perspective that defense reform is not in the positive ledger. You're in the Defense Reform Advisory Board. What do you think? So time for you to prepare while I distribute Andri's question here, which is essentially that given that circumstances have changed, both politically and in terms of outside circumstances like COVID-19, global economic slowdown and crisis, if panelists were to know now, were to know then, i.e. a year ago, in 2019, what they know now about what was awaiting Ukraine, what would the advice have been? Would the advice have changed? So that is, I'm wondering who to pitch this to while Jill is thinking defense reform. I'll actually ask myself first of all, which is that I think we were trying to future-proof to some extent in the way the conference was designed, and that you can't always, you certainly can't predict black swan events. I think that had we known then what we know now, we would have probably been a bit more explicit about the dangers of interest group and oligarchic capture of sectors of Ukrainian government and policy, and talked a bit more about why certain accomplishments like national bank independence, to which Canada contributed a whole lot, need to be preserved for their own sake, not just because someone at the IMF in Washington writes it out as a condition in the program. That's kind of my first hot take on that one. Maybe I'll punt it over to Oksana Makarova to see what she would have liked to see then if we all knew what we know now.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ambassador. It's a difficult question, but it's a question that each of us is asking ourselves all the time. It's honestly, I think we have done together collectively as much as possible. Maybe on some initiatives, maybe on some areas, I would have done, and I would have tried to speed up the processes if I knew that we only had, so to say, 6 to 8 months after, or less than a year after the reform conference, if we're talking about in terms of not calendar year. But at the same time, you know, as we joke in Ukraine, that if it takes 9 months to deliver a baby, if you take 9 women, it will not be faster. So you know, I think still looking at where we have been in 2014 and where Ukraine is now, it's still a totally different situation, and a lot of positive reforms and a lot of positive change has been done and is still being done. Sometimes it's faster, sometimes it's slower. I remember a lot of discussions, and I'm sure that Roman remembers in 2016 that reforms have slowed down because, you know, after the first year of 2015, when a lot has been, so sometimes it's waves, right? But at the same time, I believe that it's also a problem with expectations. Every time we have talked within the reform, kind of new people who came into the government, what should we do more? We should communicate better with people. We should explain better what we do. At the same time, when 95% of the TV in the country, and it's still one of the main channels of delivery of the information, belongs to the same vested interest or the business groups, which suffer from the reforms when you implement the reforms which target demonopolization and markets open and markets creation. Of course, I mean, it's even the well-minded business at first is not very happy when the tariffs increase or the other newcomers are coming into the sectors. But it has to be, I think that the question first is the continuity. We have to ensure that regardless where we are, we continue to push for the right things. And that goes to also a little bit to the previous question, what can Ukrainian World Congress do? You guys should do what you are excellent in doing. You are vocal about what you believe is right, what you support, and you say it whether you there is a better government, a worse government, where there is more reform-oriented government, less reform-oriented government. But I think ultimately the reforms is the joint exercise not only of the government, but also of business, civil society, and general or the society in general. So I cannot find big areas where we should have done something completely differently. I think maybe I should have worked, 150% of the time instead of 120, and make faster some of the changes, make them more irreversible. But in general, I think we should just continue.
Okay, thank you. We've been pretty disciplined so far in time terms. We now have about 12 minutes, I think, for remaining questions. We have 4 questions. So Jill is about to launch into defense reform. In the meantime, I would ask Taras Shevchenko to think about decentralization, a question from Mariana Nikula of Federation of Canadian Municipalities. In light of the upcoming local elections in Ukraine and recent government legislation, what's the fate of decentralization? Is local government actually getting additional powers? Are the powers being rolled back? She asks, will Canada be continuing its support? That's not a question for you, Taras. It's not even a question for me anymore, but it's something for us to think about. So you to think about it, and Jill to launch into defense reform.
Sorry, there's a bit of a lag here when the mute unmute button comes up. Look, recognizing there's not a lot of time, I'll take this on quickly. I listened carefully to Taras when you said that you didn't see the strengthening in the defense sector. Andy, thanks for your question. Your question is, why is it not in the positive side of the ledger? Well, actually, I think it's pretty close to the positive side of the ledger in many, many different ways. Let me just make a few key points here. First of all, in case people don't follow what goes on in NATO on a daily basis, I just want to note that last week, the North Atlantic Council took a decision to invite Ukraine to become an enhanced opportunity partner. This is a massive step forward. This is not about membership in NATO, totally separate. Other members of this, what's called EOP, include countries like Finland and Australia that are never going to be NATO members. But this is all about a country having the attributes in terms of the way it is doing training, the way it is trying to reform or actually has its existing systems to be able to work more closely with NATO. And so I use that as a reference point because NATO doesn't take these sorts of decisions easily or lightly. You know, so much of what goes on in defense reform is not seen. And Taras, I think you and I need a chat about this because I'd love to know more so that we can do better our work to support a really terrific team at the Defense Ministry. Minister Taran is in the job several months now, and the Chief of Defense Staff, General Homchak, working very closely as a civilian military team. Civilian accountability and control of the military, we are seeing is really progressing in the right directions. The minister has laid out a really ambitious program of reform. And anybody who knows the military or defense institutions know that they are complete worlds. So he is trying to reform policy. A lot of the major pieces of legislation that he needs to get on with what he needs to do are sitting in the RADA going through many different revisions. One piece of legislation I think had 252 revisions to it, amendments, which is great. That's what democracy is for. But there's a lot of stuff that has to happen in the RADA to enable progress to go forward. Command and control. How do you actually structure your military? A lot of work being done here, I'm delighted to say, with a lot of help from Canada, to make the Ukrainian military more Euro-Atlantic friendly, to track to standards and principles that are recognizable in our militaries and our institutions, looking at issues like planning and resource management, some of the issues that Oksana was talking about. It's a massive amount of money that goes through the Defense Ministry, putting in place modern financial practices. This is underway. Infrastructure and logistics. There's no doubt that the Ukrainian military is better trained and better equipped, but a long way from where they need to be. And I can think of issues like pensions and issues like pay and issues of accommodation and all of that for service personnel remain massive, massive challenges. But these are big pieces. They are being worked on, but it's going to take some time. Professional military education, and I would end here, extremely important to change the culture of the armed forces. And work is underway on that, but these are very, very long-term agendas and they require massive investment. What I would say is that everything suggests, and I talk here with my colleagues from the US, the UK, Poland, Germany, Lithuania, who are members of the Reform Board, we all agree that things are pointed very much in the right direction. And the issue now is to make sure that we get behind the minister behind Ukraine to make sure that for the long haul they have the support they need in this very complex area. Thank you.
Thank you, Jill. Two questions here that are basically very political. One from Paul Migos, a familiar figure at the Ministry of Finance, end of 2014, beginning of 2015, as things were first being changed. And from Michael Butsurkiu, one is about cabinet changes. Are reformers out? If not entirely out, then less influential. Interested in hearing from former ambassador, presumably me, and former minister, that's presumably you, Oksana, on what we think this means in terms of commitment to reform. And a question on the elephant in the room. That's changing from a musical to a more sort of zoological theme here. That is the charges against Poroshenko and the sort of campaign of charges, some of which are very peculiar, against representatives of the former government. Is there a risk that should these cases go ahead, they will scare away more foreign investment and donor support? After all, Poroshenko remains a respected figure among the diaspora, yes, but also in donor capital, something that I've been also mentioning in my public statements on the matter. And there's, I think, something coming out on Atlantic Council with a bunch of opinions, including even one from me on that today. So I think if you want a written version of what I might think, that'll be coming out today. I will therefore leave it to maybe Oksana, as an actual participant in the process, to reflect on commitment to reform, and maybe Taras to talk about how the perceptions of selective justice are being seen in Ukrainian civil society. So over to Taras, over to you then. Yeah.
Yeah. You also asked me previously to answer to the question about decentralization.
Yep.
So I'll do it just in
yes. Let's roll those all. Yes.
Yeah. So as to the decentralization question that we see in our Q&A, on my perspective, what I see that reform is going in proper direction with preserving main lines of the reform, more power and more money on the local level. And we will now see trying to finish with creating of amalgamating communities, and at the same time changing rayons sub-local level, which is probably quite difficult reform, because when you unite several rayons into one, some people definitely lose their rayon power and will be unhappy. So this might be the most difficult part during next several months. What I do not see on the decentralization reform, and it was not there before, is the change of government structure on the local level. Right now, I perceive the local authority structure as super presidential, when mayor concentrate all the power, and he or she is also head of local council and local executive and main political figure, and it's really a super presidential system on the local level, and a little bit Soviet with this Vykonavchi Komitet is still in place. And one phrase about the oligarchization, just going into the end of the question, if I may. Mm-hmm. I see the major line for the oligarchization is public administration reform. If government can operate independently and a proper way, then less need to be on the side on the oligarchs or seek support from the oligarchs. Unfortunately, even from civil society, I've heard quite strange views. For me is that it's okay to share some division of the policy with some oligarch and in charge of, let's say, water transportation, and give an oligarch possibility to put his people on the ministry. And because otherwise the government is not capable of doing any policy. And so that's why I'm saying on the different side that if we have public administration in place, the strong one with proper functioning, less need for any president to seek support from oligarchs.
Okay, thank you. You preempted what our last question, which had come in from Miroslava Oleksiuk. Oksana, on relative commitment to reform ministers, your successors and other counterparts, how are you feeling about that?
Thank you. Well, we hear Ukrainian people demand reforms and demand results. So we hear the commitment to reforms from the parliament, not from all of them, obviously, but from the parliament members, from the chair of the parliament, and from the ministers. These reforms, the view on what these reforms should be might be different. And the execution, again, is because even to verbally commit to reforms does not mean to execute it. But at the same time, I think, there is the institutional capacity in a lot of areas, and there are capable teams in the civil society, in the business associations and elsewhere, who will continue to push for reforms, which is very important. So even in the areas where clearly we see that there is a lack of either commitment to reform or capacity or both, I still think it's not hopeless. And I still think that as Ukraine, we don't have any other option. It's either we reform or die. And plus I want to remind again that, our powerful enemy did not disappear anywhere, and there is still war and there is still a lot of threats. So for Ukraine to be economically successful is also a national security priority. So again, yes, I might be disappointed in some of the areas, and I might not see what I expected to see or what it would be, which was in the priorities and agenda of the previous government, which I was the part of, or the previous several governments before. But I think, if anything, this is a call to unite forces and push for reforms and work from the different places rather than be disappointed, and invest into Ukraine. There are huge opportunities.
Got it. Thanks. Briefly, again, coming back to the elephant in the room, what do I think? I think it's a bad idea, going after Poroshenko selectively with legally cases that even Zelensky's previous prosecutor general has described as trash. Will it tend to scare some people away? Certainly if it goes on, yes, it could. And it leads to polarization, and it feeds the Russian agenda. I think it's a product of nature abhorring a vacuum. If people don't know what to do, then bad people with very clear ideas of what to do step in and take up the space. And in my view, that is Yanukovych's ex-legal beagle, Mr. Portnov, and a bunch of oligarchs who have decided that it's payback time. Payback time for them is bad news for the country as a whole. There's a very specific question on adult education that's coming from Roman Waschuk. I don't know if anyone's up to speed on whether something's being done in terms of upskilling and professional development in Ukraine. If somebody does, please let us know. Also, very specific mining and land control question to Matt Simpson, if you can see the chat, on foreign-owned company and rent tax stipulations. Has that impacted matters for you? And a question on defense: is it time for Ukraine to be cutting its military in terms of numbers? I'm going to turn these into, those who remember the Canadian program Reach for the Top, snappers. You've got basically 40 seconds to answer each of those. Anyone who has an answer, please raise your hand and take a stab at these. Not all at once. Jill.
Am I unmuted?
You're coming through loud and clear.
Great, look. Ukraine's at war, not of its own making. So no, you don't want to cut the number of military. What you want to do is make better use, make sure they're better trained, and you want to do all the stuff around that. Oksana said, the best way to get a resilient society, to protect sovereignty and security of Ukraine and to give Ukrainians a future is not through the military, though it's an important part when you're at war with Russia. It's to make sure that you reform and you've got accountable, sustainable institutions to take you forward. Over.
Great, thanks. Matt, anything on that mining question?
In terms of the mining question, it actually, oddly enough, makes it easier for Black Iron to implement our project, knowing that there's only one ultimate owner of the land, being Ukraine's government, as opposed to other projects where you could have many owners. that you'd have to negotiate with in order to settle a land transfer arrangement. And in our case, to be clear, that the land is ultimately owned by the state or the federal government, but is being used by the Ministry of Defense. So we do need the Ministry of Defense to agree to turn that land back to the government, which could then ultimately be leased to Black Iron. And this is actually critical for our project to move ahead. But I see it again as a positive, not only because it's one landowner, but because I think there's also an alignment where not only would we be seeking the land, but in return, we're going to provide something that is direly needed by the country, which is new barracks in NATO standard quality.
Okay, thank you very much, Matt. And then Taras and Oksana, did either of you see something on support for vocational adult education that would help upskill Ukrainians? And then we'll quickly move after, if one of you volunteers something, then we'll move it right over to CIC in Regina for some wrap-up remarks from Alex. Guess not. Let's we'll have to leave the adult ed question for another set of panelists who may be more expert in the matter, and then let's invite Alex in Saskatchewan to provide some closing thoughts and remarks.
Well, thank you everyone for joining us. Thank you to the panelists and our great moderator for taking time out of their very busy schedules to do this. This is certainly a very interesting topic, just generally, but particularly from a Canadian perspective. So we thank everyone again for attending, and we wish you all the best.
Okay, thanks again to all of our panelists and to our co-sponsors, to Taras Shevchenko, to Matt Simpson, to Jill Sinclair, to Oksana Makarova, to CIC South Saskatchewan, and especially to the masterminds at UCC National in Ottawa, to Ihor and Orest, and to the national president, Lesihichi, for taking the initiative, for remembering amid COVID, amid everything else, that the conference did actually happen a year ago, and that life has to go on in different circumstances, taking different approaches, but trying to move forward, hopefully moving from sort of pre-concert cacophony to the potpourri, to maybe the grand symphonic outcome that that we'd all hope for, although there may be some andante periods in the months ahead. Okay, so thanks again to everyone. It's been informative. I hope it's also been fun for those who have plugged in, and we will hand it over to the Lithuanians and the Swiss. I think that Chatham House will be doing a July 7th video conference with the Ukrainian Prime Minister, the Lithuanian Foreign Minister, about future plans. So those of you who just can't get enough of Ukrainian Reform conferences, move on over to our buddies at Chatham House and keep on keeping on with URC. Thanks again.